The final component out of the 5 food components is the grains component. There are several changes for the grains component in the new meal pattern. We will have a few examples in this section. Here's an overview of the main changes that you will see. Breakfast cereals now has a sugar limit of no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce, and grain-based desserts do not credit as a creditable grain towards reimbursable meals. In addition, at least 1 serving of grains each day must be whole grain rich. On October 1st, 2019, the program will require the use of ounce equivalents to determine the amount of creditable grains. More trainings and memo will be provided before October 1st, 2019 on grain ounce equivalents. Before we talk about the grains component, we need to understand some basics about grains. There are many different types of grains on the market, and we need to understand what it means to be a whole grain, a refined grain, and an enriched grain. Whole grains contain the entire grain kernel. This means that it includes the bran, which is the outer layer of the kernel, the germ, which is the small inner part of the kernel that contains high amounts of vitamins and minerals, and the endosperm, which is the large starchy inner layer. Refined grains, in contrast, are processed to remove the bran and the germ, leaving only the starchy endosperm. This process removes key nutrients. Enriched grains are refined grains which undergo processing where key nutrients such as B vitamins and iron are added back to the grain. Whole grains and enriched grains, along with bran and germ, are creditable grains, while refined grains are not creditable. When we talk about creditable and non-creditable grains, we are talking about whether they can be used as part of the reimbursable meal in the CACFP meal pattern. There are creditable grains which contribute to a reimbursable meal. These include items such as whole grains, enriched grains, bran, germ, and fortified breakfast cereals which meet sugar limit requirements. In order for meals or snacks served in the CACFP to be reimbursable, all grains served must be creditable grains. There are also non-creditable grains available in the marketplace that do not contribute towards a reimbursable meal. Non-creditable grains may not be counted as part of a reimbursable meal because they are lower in nutritional value and may contain excess sugar and fat. When non-creditable grains are mixed in with credible grains in grain products, such as crackers or breads, they are only allowable in insignificant amounts. Non-creditable grains include refined grains that do not have the nutritious bran and germ and are non-enriched. It also includes breakfast cereals that exceed the sugar limit and grain-based desserts. Breakfast cereal sugar limits and the grain-based dessert restrictions were introduced with the new meal pattern, and we will discuss these changes in more detail. In the new meal pattern, there's now a requirement that all breakfast cereals must contain no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce. There's many different types of breakfast cereals, including ready-to-eat, instant, and hot cereals. This new requirement will help reduce the intake of added sugars as recommended by the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. There are a few ways to make sure you're using an approved breakfast cereal that meets the new sugar limit. One easy way is to use the Oregon WIC approved breakfast cereal list from the Oregon WIC food list. Sponsors and providers may use the Oregon WIC cereal list because all WIC cereals meet the same sugar limit threshold. Another quick way is to compare the information on the cereal nutrition facts label to a sugar limit chart and make sure that the sugar content per serving is less than the sugar limit threshold. Finally, you can calculate out the sugar content of the cereal per dry ounce using the information from the nutrition fact label and compare it to the sugar limit threshold number. The quickest way to figure out if your cereal meets the sugar limit is to look at the Oregon WIC approved breakfast cereal list. As we mentioned earlier, all Oregon WIC approved cereals must meet the same sugar limit as CACFP. ODE-CNP has created a handout with all current Oregon WIC cereals. When using the WIC cereal list, make sure you are using the most recent list, as manufacturers may change their product formulation. The WIC cereal list is updated approximately once per year. The list on this slide is available on ODE-CNP's CACFP Meal Pattern and Menu Planning webpage. If your cereal is not on the WIC list, you can use the sugar limit wallet card. This card has two sides. The first side, the purple side, includes a sugar limit chart for yogurt and was discussed in the section for meat and meat alternates. The second side, this is the blue side, includes a sugar limit chart for cereal. This wallet card is available on ODE-CNP's CACFP webpage. Let's try out the wallet card with an example. In this example, first, find the serving size. The serving size is 32 grams. Next, you will want to find the total amount of sugar per serving size. Here, the total sugar is listed as 12 grams. Once you have the serving size and total sugar for your cereal, you will go to your sugar limit chart on the sugar limit wallet card. Find the column which says serving size and find the serving size for your cereal. The cereal we looked at had 32 grams per serving. Look for the range that has 32. There's a range for 31 to 35 grams. Then, look to the column to the right, which has the sugar limit. In this case, the limit for the cereal, whose serving size is 31 to 35 grams, would be 7 grams of sugar. This means any cereal with a serving size of 31 to 35 grams cannot have a total sugar amount higher than 7 grams. Did the cereal have greater than 7 grams of sugar? Yes, it had 12 grams of sugar. This example would not meet the sugar limit and would not be a creditable cereal. If the cereal you are serving is not on the WIC approved list and the serving size can't be found on the breakfast cereal sugar limit chart, you can calculate whether it meets the sugar limit threshold by looking at the nutrition facts label, finding the serving size in grams, and then finding the amount for sugars. The threshold formula is calculated by using the language of the sugar limit requirement. Breakfast cereals must contain no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce. 1 dry ounce of cereal is approximately 28 grams. So, 6 grams of sugar divided by 28 grams equals 0.212. Using the example here, first, look at the nutrition facts label. Next, find the serving size, which is highlighted in the red box near the top of the nutrition facts label. The serving size is 28 grams. Note, you will want to look at the grams, which is the measurement of weight, and not the cup, which is the measurement of volume, when you are calculating sugar content. Now, you will find the amount for sugars, which is highlighted in the red box near the bottom of the nutrition facts label. The total sugar is 1 gram. Once you have the serving size and the total sugar, you can calculate the amount of sugar per serving by dividing the total sugar by the serving size. Your total sugar is 1 gram, and the serving size was 28 grams. This calculates out to 0.036 grams of sugar per serving size. 0.036 is less than the threshold of 0.212. As long as your calculation is less than or equal to 0.212, your breakfast cereal will be creditable. This cereal is creditable. Once you have figured out that your breakfast cereal meets the sugar limit requirement, remember to write in both the brand name and the name of the cereal on your menu. In our example on the slide, General Mills Kix is served, so you can write in GM Kix. By having both the brand name and the name of the cereal, it clearly indicates which cereal you're serving. In addition to documenting the cereal that you're serving on the menu, make sure that you save the front packaging and the nutrition facts label to document that your cereal meets the sugar limit threshold requirement. In addition to breakfast cereals, another change to the grains component is with grain-based desserts. Grain-based desserts are no longer creditable towards any reimbursable meals and snacks in CACFP due to their impact on overall health. Because grain-based desserts are a source of added sugars and saturated fats, they contribute to increased risk of chronic illnesses. To determine which grain items are considered grain-based desserts, use the Exhibit A chart. Exhibit A was created by USDA, and the table can be found on the ODE CNP CACFP webpage. Exhibit A is a list of grains grouped together by type and ingredient composition. The columns also include their required portion sizes. When you are trying to determine whether an item is a grain-based dessert, you'll take a look at the color coding. Items in red are considered grain-based desserts and will no longer credit for the grains component. Items in blue or black are not considered to be grain-based desserts and will still be allowed as a creditable grain item for CACFP as long as it meets all other creditable grain requirements. Here is a list of grain-based desserts. This is by no means a complete list, but it covers some of the common grain-based desserts that are served. Some common grain-based desserts include breakfast bars, brownies, cereal bars, cookies, and toaster pastries. None of the items listed here will be creditable towards a reimbursable meal. If you're not sure whether an item will be considered a grain-based dessert, take a look at Exhibit A. If the item is not listed on Exhibit A, think about whether the item would be commonly considered a dessert. If it is considered a dessert, do not serve the item as part of the grain component for any reimbursable meals you serve in CACFP. If you're still not sure, contact your assigned child nutrition specialist. Sometimes sponsors and providers may want to have grain-based desserts to celebrate special events. Grain-based desserts may be served as an additional or bonus item. This means that the grain-based dessert will not count towards the grain component, but can be served as an extra item only. When you serve bonus items or other non-creditable items with CACFP meals, please note that CACFP nonprofit food service funds cannot be used for unallowable costs, including grain-based desserts. Here are two menu examples. In the first example at the left, the menu includes whole grain pasta with meat sauce, fruit salad, a shredded kale salad with 1% milk, and a bonus cookie. This would be a reimbursable meal because it includes all of the required food component with the cookie as a bonus item only. In the second example at the right, this breakfast menu lists toaster pastries, strawberries, and milk. The grain-based dessert is being served as part of the reimbursable grain component, which is not allowed. This would not be a reimbursable meal. We have two questions for you to answer in this section. First question. Your site supervisor wants to serve graham crackers with milk for a snack. Is this a reimbursable snack? The answer is yes. With the release of the new grain-based dessert memo on July 26, 2017, sweet crackers are now allowed as a grain component, and graham crackers with milk would be a reimbursable two-component snack. Question 2. The next day, your site supervisor decides to serve granola bars with apple slices for snack. Is this a reimbursable snack? The answer is no. This would not be a reimbursable snack because granola bars are still considered to be a grain-based dessert. The site supervisor would need to substitute this item or serve the snack with another creditable item such as yogurt, milk, or vegetable for this to be considered a reimbursable snack. Remember that all snacks require two components, and items served as a bonus or extra item cannot use CACFP funding. Remember that all grains served in the CACFP must be creditable. In the past few slides, we have discussed grain items that are creditable and non-creditable. Creditable grains can be any one of the following: whole grains, enriched grains, bran, germ, or fortified cereals. In addition to being creditable, in the new CACFP meal pattern, there's a new requirement that at least once per day, a serving of grains must be whole grain rich. This means that if you are serving a breakfast, lunch, and afternoon snack, that only one of the meals will need to have a whole grain rich item. What does it mean for a grain item to be whole grain rich? The USDA's definition of whole grain rich foods are foods that contain 100% whole grains, or at least 50% whole grains, and the remaining grains in the food are enriched. How do you determine if your item is whole grain rich? There are 6 ways for a grain product to meet the whole grain rich criteria. The first and simplest way of figuring out if your item is whole grain rich is by looking at the WIC whole grain food list. Any item on any state's whole grain food list will be considered whole grain rich. The second way is to see if the food is labeled as whole wheat and has a standard of identity. Only certain pastas and breads will have a standard of identity. The third way is met if your item has one of the 2 FDA-approved whole grain health claims on the package. The fourth method is if your item meets the whole grain rich criteria for the National School Lunch Program. The fifth method is to get proper documentation from a manufacturer or to have a standardized recipe showing that whole grains are the primary grain ingredient by weight. Finally, with our sixth method, this is also known as the Rule of 3. In this method, you will need to check the packaging of your grain product and find the ingredient list. In order to meet the requirements of the Rule of 3, the first ingredient on the food's ingredient list, or the second ingredient after water, must be a whole grain. If there are any other grain ingredients, the next 2 grain ingredients must also be creditable by being a whole grain, enriched grain, bran, or germ. If the item is a fortified breakfast cereal, if the first ingredient is a whole grain and the cereal is fortified, the item will also meet the Rule of 3. Let's take an in-depth look at each of these methods. In Method 1, if the item you're using is on any state agency's WIC food list, then it is considered whole grain rich. This is a great method because each state has their own list with brand names, so you can pick and choose items that you can find in the grocery store. ODE-CNP has created an Oregon WIC whole grain items handout and will be keeping this list updated. This list is shown on the left-hand side of this slide. All items on that list with the top brown border is whole grain rich. The list on the right-hand side is the Oregon WIC cereal list, which you have seen earlier. Not all WIC cereals will be whole grain rich, so you will want to look for the purple circle with the W in the center. This purple mark indicates that the cereal is whole grain rich. Here is a closer look at All Bran, and you can see that it has a purple circle, while Corn Flakes right next to it does not have that purple circle. In this case, all bran would be whole grain rich, while cornflakes would not. Since any WIC food list whole grain items will be whole grain rich, feel free to use other states' food lists as well, especially if you are near the Oregon border and have access to grocery stores in those states. Just remember to keep documentation that shows your item is listed on the WIC food list. This means you should print out the list and save the packaging for your item showing that it matches with the WIC whole grain item. WIC lists do get updated. If you end up using another state's WIC list, it will be your responsibility to make sure that you are using the most current list. Moving on to method 2. If your product is labeled as whole wheat and includes a standard of identity issued by the FDA, then it will be considered whole grain rich. A standard of identity means that the manufacturer declares their item is verified to have certain ingredients in the item. This means that whole wheat bread must have a certain amount of whole wheat in order for the manufacturer to call it a whole wheat bread. The only grain products that have a standard of identity are breads and pastas. This means that this method will only work for breads and pastas with the exact names shown on this slide. This list of breads and pastas with a standard of identity is also available on the grains flowchart handout available on the CACFP meal pattern and menu planning page. If your grain product doesn't match one of these names on this list exactly, then it does not meet this particular method of crediting whole grain rich. Next, under method 3, if your item has an FDA-approved whole grain health claim on its packaging, it will be considered whole grain rich. The whole grain health claims can be hard to find because it's very wordy and manufacturers will place them on the bottom or sides of packaging. If you look closely though, you might find one of these two statements. The two valid statements are shown on this slide. The first statement is, diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease and some cancers. The second statement is very similar. It is, diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in saturated fat and cholesterol may help reduce the risk of heart disease. Remember that it must include the whole statement in order to be valid. There are other similar statements out there on the market for soluble fiber, but those are not valid for the whole grain rich requirement. You will want to double check the statement and make sure it includes the words whole grain foods in the statement to make sure that you have the valid statement. Method 4 will mostly be helpful for school districts and centers who vend from school districts. If a food item meets the whole grain rich criteria in the National School Lunch Program, also known as NSLP, then it will also meet the whole grain rich criteria for CACFP. This is because the definition for the whole grain rich is the same for both NSLP and for CACFP. If you would like to find out the specifics for crediting a whole grain rich item under NSLP, take a look at the whole grain resource for the National School Lunch and School Breakfast programs. In the whole grain resource, there is a flowchart which you can see on this slide that provides information on which grain items are whole grain rich. Next, for method 5, if you have proper documentation from a manufacturer or standardized recipe that shows the primary grains by weight are whole grains, then you can count your item as whole grain rich. These can include child nutrition labels, product formulation statements, and standardized recipes. Child nutrition labels are also known as CN labels. CN labels always have a border with the letter CN on all 4 sides. Inside, it documents the meal components that can be credited for each serving. For grains, in order for the grain component to be considered whole grain rich, The CN label must state that the item has ounce equivalent grains. You can see that the cheese pizza on the left of this slide has 2.0 ounce equivalent grains for each wedge. This indicates that this cheese pizza has 2.0 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich grains per wedge and would meet Method 5 for showing proper documentation of a whole grain rich product. On the right side, there's another sample CN label for a pizza with ground beef. On this CN label, the grain component is listed as a bread alternate. If the CN label shows the grain portion as a bread alternate and not as an ounce equivalent, then the grain item will not be whole grain rich. Not all processed items will have child nutrition labels. These are only available for combination food items with meat or meat alternates in the product and are mostly available through suppliers who work with schools. If you do not have a child nutrition label on your purchased grain item and you would like to have manufacturer's labeling indicating that the product meets whole grain rich requirements, then you will need to have a product formulation statement. Product formulation statements, or PFSs, can be requested from the manufacturer. Here's a sample product formulation statement. While templates may vary, they all need to have the following information in order to be used as verification for whole grain rich crediting. First, make sure that the PFS is on the manufacturer's letterhead. Then you will want to make sure that the product name on the PFS matches your product. Next, the manufacturer should indicate if it meets the whole grain rich criteria and whether it has any non-creditable grains in the product. Most importantly, they must have a chart showing the creditable grains by ingredient and the weight as well as total creditable contribution. The whole grain rich ingredient must make up at least 50% of the grain ingredients by weight in order for the product to be whole grain rich. Finally, make sure that there is a signature and contact information at the bottom of the PFS verifying that the information is correct. Sponsors and providers who want to use commercial combination foods to credit grains must have either a product formulation statement or a CN label showing how the items credit for each component on file before they start to serve the food items. For product formulation statements to credit as a whole grain rich product as well, the product formulation statement must indicate the whole grain ingredient is the primary grain ingredient by weight and that portion sizes are met. In Method 5, if you're making your own grain product at your site, you can also use a standardized recipe to credit your item as whole grain rich. Make sure you're using a standardized recipe with CACFP crediting information available for each portion serving. In your recipe, at least half your grain ingredients should be whole grains, and the rest of the grain ingredients must be either whole grains, enriched grains, bran, or germ in order for your grain product to be considered whole grain rich. Here is a sample standardized recipe for low-fat pumpkin bread from the OSU Extension Food Heroes webpage. The recipe also includes a second page that's not shown here, which provides detailed information on how to prepare and serve the bread in order to meet portion sizes. Standardized recipes are recipes that have been analyzed and verified to meet meal pattern requirements for each serving. If you do not want to create your own standardized recipes, you can find recipes that have already been standardized for CACFP by checking out the ODE-CNP's CACFP meal pattern and menu planning webpage for links to sites with standardized recipes. The recipe shown here for low-fat pumpkin bread credits as a whole grain rich item. This is because it has 2 grain ingredients, whole wheat flour and enriched all-purpose flour. You you can see that the weight of the whole wheat flour is at 1 pound 12 ounces, which is slightly higher than the enriched all-purpose flour at 1 pound 10.4 ounces. This makes whole wheat flour the primary grain ingredient. The recipe verifies that the pumpkin bread is whole grain rich because whole wheat flour is the primary grain ingredient and the rest of the grain ingredient is enriched. Therefore, this is a creditable item. Additionally, you can see that the recipe also provides the crediting information for CACFP as well as other child nutrition programs. Keep all standardized recipes with your menu documentation in order to verify that your grain items meet the whole grain rich requirements and portion size requirements by age group. Finally, there's method 6. This method is also known as the rule of 3. In the rule of 3, you must look at the ingredient list on your product, like the one shown on this slide. There are 2 criteria in which you will be looking at the first 3 grain ingredients on the ingredient list. In the first criteria, make sure the first ingredient, or second after water, is a whole grain. Then, in the second criteria, if there are any additional grains on the ingredient list, you will want to make sure that the next 2 grain ingredients are either whole grains, enriched grains, bran, or germ. Any additional grains after the first 3 grain ingredients on this list will be considered insignificant and do not need to be counted. In addition, if the second or third grain ingredient is listed after the statement contains 2% or less on the ingredient list, it will also be considered insignificant and can be disregarded. In our example on the slide, take a look at the first ingredient. Is it a whole grain? Yes, it is a whole grain wheat flour, which is a whole grain. So it meets the first criteria for the rule of 3. Since it meets the first criteria, you will want to check to make sure that it meets the second criteria as well. In the second criteria, check if there are any other grain ingredients. If there are, you will need to look for the next 2 grain ingredients. In this case, there are no additional grain ingredients since the only other grain item is cornstarch, and cornstarch is considered a grain derivative and does not need to be counted towards the rule of 3. In addition to cornstarch, other examples of grain derivatives include wheat gluten, wheat starch, wheat dextrin, corn dextrin, rice starch, tapioca starch, and modified food starch. These grain derivatives can be considered disregarded ingredients and do not need to be counted as part of the 3 grain ingredients when looking at the rule of 3. Most of the time, it will be easy to figure out whether your item is whole grain rich or not, and which method you should be using to credit your items. However, once in a while, you might need a little more help to figure out if your item is whole grain rich or not. In those cases, you'll want to use the whole grain rich flowchart. This flowchart and the creditable grains flowchart can be found on the CACFP meal pattern and menu planning page. Now that you've learned the 6 different ways to verify a product is whole grain rich, let's take a look at 2 quick examples. In this first example, we have wheat tortilla. We have an ingredient list for this tortilla and nothing else. Because of this, we will need to use method 6, the rule of 3. Let's take a look at the tortilla's ingredients and figure out if this is whole grain rich. The first grain ingredient after water by weight is modified food starch. Modified food starch is not a whole grain, and in fact, it's not even a creditable grain. Although whole wheat flour is the second grain ingredient, because the first ingredient is not a creditable grain at all, this item does not meet the first criteria of the rule of 3. This item is not whole grain rich, and because the first ingredient is not a creditable grain, it will also not be considered a creditable grain either. When choosing grain products, be careful and read the packaging or ingredient label to make sure that it meets one of the 6 methods of determining whole grain-rich items before you purchase it. Some items try to appear healthier than they are, but may not contain enough whole grains to be a whole grain-rich item. Next, let's take a look at our second example. This egg and cheese wrap is a combination food item with a CN label. Reading the CN label, you can see that one wrap provides 2 ounce equivalents of meat alternates and 1 ounce equivalent of grains. Because it says ounce equivalents for the grains component and not bread alternate, this CN label indicates that the grain component meets the whole grain rich requirement. This item is both creditable and whole grain rich. When it comes to meeting the whole grain rich requirements, remember that at least one meal or snack must include a whole grain rich food every day. For example, if a site only serves supper, the grain component at supper must be whole grain rich. Similarly, for sponsors or providers who only serve breakfast, the grain served at breakfast must be whole grain rich. However, if the site serves multiple meals, such as breakfast, lunch, and snack, the sponsor or provider can choose which meal to serve the whole grain rich food. All other grain components will still need to be creditable, but will not need to meet whole grain rich requirements. For best practice, it is recommended that all grains served are whole grain rich. If you do serve multiple meals a day, some grain items that are served may be whole grain rich and some may only be creditable. In order to verify that whole grain rich components have been served at least once per day, sponsors and providers must document whole grain rich foods on the menu. Take a look at this example. When serving bread, you can indicate that it's whole wheat bread by documenting WW on the menu. Abbreviations such as WGR for whole grain rich, WW for whole wheat, or WG for whole grain may be used. All grain items being credited towards the once per day whole grain rich requirements must have supporting documentation on file showing that the items served meet one of the 6 methods of determining whole grain rich items. Supporting documentation can include WIC lists, packaging, nutrition facts labels, ingredient list information, CN labels, product formulation statements, or recipes. The documentation saved will vary depending on which method you're using. For example, items meeting whole grain rich requirements through the rule of 3 will need to have both the front packaging and the ingredient list saved. With this change in requirements for grains, during an administrative review, your specialist will review your menus, packages, labels, and product formulation sheets to ensure that they meet grain requirements. If you have served grains for the day and a whole grain rich food was not served, the meal or snack with the lowest reimbursement will be disallowed. For example, a sponsor or provider might serve breakfast, lunch, and snack, and all meals included a grain component. However, none of the components included a whole grain rich food. In this case, the lowest reimbursed meal, the snack, would be disallowed. Currently, we are still using the same portion sizing requirements as the prior meal pattern. However, CACFP will be moving towards a unified system of portion sizing. This is called ounce equivalents and will be implemented starting October 1st, 2019. What this means is that instead of having one slice as the serving size for a grain, you will have a portion measurement in ounce equivalents. Exhibit A, which we also use to determine if items are grain-based desserts, can be used as a portion size guide for ounce equivalents. More guidance will be provided before October 1st, 2019. In this section, we learned that breakfast cereals must contain no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce. We also learned that grain-based desserts no longer credit towards reimbursable meals. Next, we discussed the new requirement to have at least 1 grain per day be a whole grain-rich item. And finally, we briefly looked at ounce equivalents, which will be used starting October 1st, 2019. The next section will be on additional changes to the meal pattern.